Hello, and welcome to Season 2 of Lightwork Presents Everything is Connected, where we share inspiring stories with artists and art professionals on a wide range of topics, including race, work ethics, inspiration, and the ways in which art influences and is affected by culture. Join us as we continue the journey of sharing the interesting and inspiring stories of some of today's hottest artists and art professionals in the industry. Let's go! On this episode, we're joined by Marcus Leslie Singleton. The Brooklyn-based painter depicts intimate moments of Black life. He has exhibited his work at galleries and art fairs in New York, Los Angeles, and Seattle. Singleton reflects on the process of identity building and questions around Black consciousness. Marcus, thank you so much for joining the episode. I can't wait to get started with you.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
So I'd like to just dive right in and go with the first question. I was reading something about you recently, and you had shared a note on Instagram about being raised with your grandfather and working with your grandfather in construction. And you talked a little bit about that experience of working from a very young age and how that instilled a lot of discipline in you. Can you speak a little bit more about that experience?
Yeah, I think I was probably like 13 when I started working, and he had a family landscaping / construction business. I think it was like called L&H. My grandfather's name was Leslie, and my grandmother's name was Helen, so it was just like very simply named L&H Landscaping. But anyway, so in the summertime, they would come pick me up, and instead of like playing basketball or hanging out with the kids in the neighborhood, I'd have to work for like 3 or 4 days out of the week. And even though it was like really painful then, it taught me a lot of, just discipline, getting up early. We would leave early, like 8 o'clock, and we'd go to all these different places. This was in Washington State.
Is that where you're from?
Yeah, I was born in Seattle, and I was raised in like Tacoma area. And this particular, like we would do a lot of things in Tacoma and like North Seattle. So it was mostly landscaping, and it was hard work. I mean, building gardens, bricklaying. And I think that's also where I got my love for working with my hands. It was just like, even though it wasn't my favorite thing to do, it taught me how to work with my hands and use things and build things. And I think over time, I did start to enjoy it in a strange way. Just in terms of like, I got to kick it with my grandfather. He was cool. And, it was kind of like, my phone off. And it was kind of just like, I was allowed to build my own income. I had my own income. So during the beginning of school, I could go out and get whatever outfit I wanted. Didn't have to ask my parents for anything. I mean, it was cool. There was a lot of perks to it.
That sounds very interesting. As you were describing it, I was thinking of a few different questions, but the most prominent that sticks out is just thinking about being in the Seattle area and growing up in Tacoma and what that environment must have been like for you. Just, as someone who now lives in New York, and we've met through you being in New York, I'm from Brooklyn, just being an East Coast girl, kind of thinking about not only just the landscape, but also like community-wise, like what was it like to grow up in Tacoma?
Yeah, so the community, I don't know if you've ever been to Washington, but it's like a very white state. There's not a lot of, I think Seattle is a pretty diverse city, but outside of that, there's not really a lot of diversity. I mean, Tacoma, my neighborhood that I grew up in, there was a lot of Black people. We were living in a lower income neighborhood. And, during that time, I was like 8 or 9. My friends, and also another key point is that I was homeschooled during that time we were living in Tacoma, because like that area, for whatever reason, my parents didn't want me to go to the public school. Probably just because it was like underfunded, and my mom raised both my sister and I, and so she homeschooled us for those, I think kindergarten to third grade, I was homeschooled. But so it was interesting because during the day, all my friends would be at school, and I have school for like 2 hours in the morning with my mom and my sister. And I'd be like, all right, cool, I'm going to go outside. So I go outside, and there's nobody to play with, It's just my sister and I. And I have to wait till like 3:30 till my friends came home. But it was just like, there was a lot of space, much different than Brooklyn. There was a lot of space. My neighbors, if I remember, they were mostly white kids. There's a couple black kids. I have my friend Darius. I don't even know where he's at or where he is these days. But I remember Darius and I, we would chill. I remember one 4th of July, we were kind of playing with fireworks. Yeah, it was a very like close knit, tight block. Everybody on the premises knew each other, and my grandparents, the house I grew up in, was my grandparents' home years prior to my parents moving in. So it was kind of like a house that was passed down through a couple generations there. I don't have any like striking memories from that house. I do remember my grandmother passed down her garden to my mother, and she had a beautiful garden. Like, she grew vegetables. There was an apple tree. There was a peach tree. Yeah, it was cool. I mean, I have very fond memories of growing up in Tacoma.
And since you've left and relocated to the city, have you been back?
I have. I went back earlier this year, and before that, a few years. I think it was like 2018. I went back. At the time I was living there, I moved to New York in 2013. But when I was living there, I wasn't really making art. I was kind of making music, and I was slowly starting to get into the arts while I was living there. When I went back the last time, I had learned that there's a lot of art history up there. I mean, Jacob Lawrence lived there for a while. Yes, he had an exhibit at the Seattle Art Museum that I went to. That was wonderful. There's I forget the guy's name. To the Underground Museum.
Noah Davis.
Noah Davis is from there.
He's so phenomenal.
Yeah, and so when you think about Seattle, it's kind of like personalities like that are very extremely creative and working with what's around them in their landscape. So I think I also pulled from that a little bit. That watered me. Yeah. Just being in that lush environment, having the juxtaposition between like this very lush nature landscape and then also city life. And I think that's like still ingrained in my practice today. It's just kind of like, that's always going to be there. It's such a beautiful place to grow up. And if I was still living there, I think the art, I mean, it's informed in my practice today, but also like if I was making art in Seattle, I would like to see how that would be in real time, because there's just so many beautiful areas. And for a Black person to be in those types of spaces where, there's one of you to the 20 other, white people in the area. I mean, I think being in Brooklyn, going back now, that would be even more striking, especially living there. I don't think I would ever go back to live there, but to visit, I think it would definitely, that would inspire some conversations.
Based on some of the things that you've said so far, I get the impression that you had an environment that you grew up in that allowed you to think creatively and think outside of the box. I mean, just my initial assumption is that being homeschooled is different than going to a regular public school. So that therein lies a very important distinction that a parent is making with their child to do something different. And then you spoke about being involved in music before you started making your art. And so I wanted to ask a little bit about, how did you get to the point where you sort of began to take your art making more seriously and began to think of yourself as an artist? Like, what were the years that was happening, and what was going on in your life when that was happening?
It's a wonderful question. I would say 2012. I would say 2012 is when I started first kind of getting interested in art. And when I say art, I mean sonically working with my hands, kind of allowing myself to think creatively. Because I think before that, I was just more so invested with what my friends were doing, and I was playing basketball, smoking, all that regular high school stuff, which was cool. I mean, I definitely learned some things from that, but as you get older, you just kind of understand yourself more, and you're like, actually, I'm more interested in exploring this other landscape. So I would say 2012, and I started that, and I went to a community college for a month or two in Olympia, and I met this girl there who was a drummer, and she and I started this punk rock band. We were really bad, but it was fun.
I love it.
Yeah, we were really bad, and that was cool. But I also felt that I couldn't really communicate as clearly as I wanted to through music, and I felt that, and it was just something that I couldn't articulate at the time. And I think that further, it kind of drove my curiosity to have an inner dialogue within ways of like, how can I creatively tell stories the way I want to? Because music is cool, but it's just like I'm not naturally gifted in that. And I think I recognized that early on, experimenting that. I'm like, all right, cool. This is fun, but it's not clicking the way I think it should click. And so one day I kind of went to the art supply store and bought a canvas, bought some oil paint, and I started painting. And like in that moment, I just realized that this was something that I loved to do. I didn't know why I loved it. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know why I was doing it. I didn't know what I was painting, but I instantly fell in love with it, and I've been doing it since then. And when I first started painting, it was completely abstract. And all those paintings are probably somewhere in the Seattle store. I don't know where those paintings are. They may have been destroyed, like in some type of recycling facility. But yeah, that's where I started painting. And then I moved to New York like a year later. And during that time coming from Seattle to New York is when I started considering making art my career. And it was, for me, it was kind of like I always wanted to make what I love to do my main income. And it was a tricky way to do that because I didn't want it to come off as like transactional. Like I didn't want to make art to make money, but I knew I wanted it to support my life. Like, and I wanted to do that for the rest of my life. So it took me a while to like siphon out and position myself in a way to where that was possible.
Right. And can you talk to me a little bit about the experiences of like just moving to New York and like leaving home and coming to the city, and maybe what that was like for you? I just can only imagine.
Yeah, I didn't know anybody here. I was really heavily using Tumblr at the time. And
Tumblr was hot. Tumblr was a thing. I mean, like everybody had a Tumblr.
Yeah. And it was cool because that's before social media was so, I want to use the word invasive.
Right.
But it was just like, you go on there and you could see what people are doing across the globe and really get a feel for what that community was like. Mm-hmm. And I saw this movement in Brooklyn of all these young Black creatives, and I was like, wow, I think that's where I need to go. And I started reaching out, emailing, Some people answered, some people didn't, but I was like, I think that I'm gonna try to go out here for a year and see what happens. So I came out, and here I am, 8 years later, 9 years later, still making my art out here. So I mean, it was that transition coming from Seattle to New York. It was intimidating when I first got here. I didn't really have a plan. I came here really with no plan. I had a little bit of a savings account, but it was just mostly off pure will, which was, in hindsight, not the smartest approach. But, I got here, I got a little job. I was like working as a security guard just for a year or two, and got a room. I didn't have a studio for like the first 4 years I was living here. I was just kind of like making art in my bedroom, and very small scale. But that whole transition was challenging. It was challenging. New York kicked my ass for the first couple years I was here. It was just trying to. I mean, you're from here, so I'm sure it's completely different for you. But it took me a few years to find my footing, just to become somewhat stable, to where I had sometimes living in New York, you can move every 6 months. So it took me a while to lock a cool spot down. Then after I did that, I was able to have time to save some money and get a studio. And that's kind of like when I first got the studios, where the ball started rolling.
And so what were some of the biggest changes that you experienced once you got your studio? Aside from the ability to just go someplace and make work, but like, how did your practice change?
Oh, it changed completely. I mean, I think the most integral part about it was be able to have visits, because like I wasn't even showing my work before that, let alone having visits, because I wasn't going to tell people to come to the house. My roommates are in the kitchen cooking and things like that. It just wasn't the right setup. So I would say that was a huge tipping point, being able to have studio visits, and how it changed my practice. I think I was able to be in a more intimate headspace, because almost metaphorically, I was able to go there and shut the door, and I don't think I had that before. I was always making art in some type of public setting, whether it was like background noise or sketchbooks outside in the park, or so once I got that studio, I was able to physically and metaphorically shut the door, and I think that allowed me to kind of figure out a good recipe for how I approach art making. And that was, and I'm still to this day doing that. I'm super research based. Like I read a lot. I watch a lot of films, like independent films, listen to a lot of music. And I'm kind of a person where I like something, I just get into that thing for like 2 weeks. I'll play the same song for 2 weeks. Oh man, I really,
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, you know how it is.
Yeah.
So I was able to. The studio allowed me to kind of capitalize on that.
Would you say that there's something similar within the way you make art too? Like if like maybe you're on a theme or you're on an idea or concept and you just dig into it, and like the next few pieces are all like about this thing,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I love doing that. And I think, and it's so funny because, like throughout the years of making paintings, it's like you make paintings, but the approach changes. And you're still doing the same action, but the way you approach it changes. So, I mean, when I first started painting, I was just like, all right, I'm going to make a blue pan, make a red pan, like kind of teach myself color theory. And did that. And then, okay, now I'm going to try painting figures. I'm going to try painting dancers. I'm going to try painting boxers, teaching myself figuration a little bit. When I got the studio, I was like, okay, like let me try to put together like a showable body of work. So kind of like the first body of work I think I made was circus based, and I was like, I remember finding out about Calder, and he did that little circus. He had created a circus out of wire puppets, and I thought that was very interesting. And I didn't think that there was many artists, especially black artists, that were talking about the circus. And so I thought it would be a good idea to like have parallel those ideas of black life and circus. And like, I mean, the two streams of thought for me with that approach to that body of work were like how incredibly dexterous black people are, like to survive everything we've been to and still be that magnificent. And also on the other side, life is just unpredictable most times. And so like that, the circus kind of, when I was researching circus, and also there's a lot of racial connotations to clowns and that type of thing too, which is a whole, I could go on a whole other, that's a whole other conversation. But I mean, that was my first body of work. And circling all the way back to that question you read, that's like kind of what the studio did for me. Having a studio space, I think, is so important for any artist, whether you're a writer, sculptor, whatever, like your own. It's just, so that really gave me the space to really think about how to make a series of work. And that's how I work to this day. I've spent this past, I'm talking a lot, I'm sorry.
Please. Please, I want to hear more.
This past body of work I did about my family was like, it took me 5 months to do, but I, like in the past 2 years, both my grandparents have passed away.
I'm sorry.
And they lived a really long, beautiful life. So even though that was sad, it was cool to actually like know them for that long time, and I felt honored to be able to do that. But I also kind of felt like it would be interesting to talk about their story, and I wouldn't be here without them. So over the past couple years, I've been slowly accumulating family articles, and so I've been actually just like, instead of going to the library or like going to the bookstore and buying books, I've actually just been asking family members to send me documents about our family. And I've been referencing those into my paintings. And so that was this past body of work that I did. But it's the same. Sorry, it was the same. It was the same approach, but just now I'm getting kind of integral in like doing some real work on like family history.
I wanted to segue a little bit and talk about your practice more pointedly. And so you're a self-taught artist, correct?
Right.
So you didn't go to art school?
No, I didn't go to art school. I went to the Seattle Arts. I went to the Seattle Art Institute, which no longer exists. I went there for a few months, but I was studying textiles, because I was thinking about getting into fashion at that time. So, I mean, I did a lot of different things. I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I knew I wanted to work in art. So I thought it was music, and then I went into textile, and then I went into painting. But that was my only academic training in the arts, and that was only for a few months. But painting was something that I just tried and ended up loving. So I'll say I taught myself how to paint, yeah.
And can you share some of the shows that you've done so far, some of the exhibitions that you've done so far? I'd really love for for the audience to kind of know, like, where have you shown your work? What do you have on your plate right now? I know you have an exhibition right now at Journal Gallery in New York.
Yeah, I've done 4 solos. First show I did in New York was actually this gallery. It's no longer in that location, but the gallery is called Medium Teens, and it was near the Brooklyn Museum at the time that I showed there. I think that was 2016, 17, somewhere around there. And then I showed at Turn Gallery, which is now on 86 66th Street, or excuse me, 68th Street. That's where I showed the circus paintings. And that was kind of like the first show that people started paying attention to what I was doing. I've done some group shows. I've done Freeze. I've done Freeze in LA. Done Future Fair. I've got two museum acquisitions now. One at the San Antonio Art Museum, and another one that's coming soon. I can't say it just yet, but but that's, and I feeling good about that. I did a show at the Albany Museum that's associated with the university up there. That was a group show. That was a special show. And I did a solo in 2020 at the Journal Gallery again. That one was during the thick of the pandemic, so it was kind of like showing work during that time. It was interesting,
Yeah.
because there wasn't a lot of people in the city. A lot of people left the city at the time.
Mm.
So I did a show then. Well, right now, and I have another show at the Journal Gallery, and then I have a group show coming up with Superposition.
Beautiful.
In New York. There's a Black Historical Museum up there that we're doing a group show with Superposition.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I love Storm's program. She's doing some really wonderful things. And I love that her gallery concept is nomadic and sort of, exists within the digital space, where she can just sort of pop up and put a show together by collaborating with someone, but she doesn't have to have a physical space to maintain all the time.
Right. I love that. And that's all due with relations, because like if your relationships are good, you kind of don't really need a brick and mortar. It's like, let's collaborate with this space and put these artists here for this month, and then do something. I love Storm, and I love what she's doing. She's a great person and great program.
Yeah.
And she was actually one of the first people to show me in LA. We did a group show in LA way back, like 2016 or something like that. So we've been working together for a while. And yeah, I love her. I feel like I've missed so many things concerning the shows that I've done and will do. But yeah,
What do you mean when you say that?
Huh?
What do you mean when you say that? Like by not being present?
I just listing off the shows that.
Right.
Yeah, if they pop back into my head, I'll let you know. But yeah, I have to pull up my CV.
Yes. And then, we have a final few minutes, but I wanted to ask, if you could describe your work, talk to me a little bit about it in your own words. What are you tackling? What are the, some of the issues around what you sort of want to uncover when you're making work? What is your work about?
Yeah, I think I could talk best about the work and the work that's in the show at Journal right now.
Mm-hmm.
And recently, I think I've gotten in a good cadence of making paintings the way I love to make paintings, which is storytelling, simply storytelling. And I think storytelling in a way to where it's effective not only for me, but like as a way of almost like a seminar, or like a talk back. Like it's a communication between a two-dimensional object and me. And so the work that I'm making now is all about it's all about kind of telling these stories in a way to where I can communicate clearly with my audience without speaking. Like using color and form, figuration to tell a story. And so this body of work that I produced, it was pulling from my personal history, but also like in the South, I've been studying these Gee's Benz quilts. And those ladies were geniuses because they've done it all within those quilts. As far as communication goes, they've communicated so accurately and so meticulously in those quilts. And that's kind of like how I want to approach my art, and how I would love my art to communicate. They've put together patterns that aren't really rooted in written language, but more so of like pattern making and pattern recognition in colors and color theory. And like during that time, it was a method of survival for them because they weren't really allowed to speak to one another, so they would put the message in the quilts. And I thought that was really fascinating. And I drew parallels with that into how I make my work, because I would love my work to speak clearly and effectively like that. And I think it takes a lot of patience and a lot of care to do that. And that's how I approach my work. Well, it takes I wouldn't call myself a slow painter, but I do take my time, and I do make sure that what I'm putting out there is what's in my heart and on my mind. So, going through those topics, and also circling back to my upbringing in Tacoma and Seattle, I also talk about that in the work too. I'm touching on the Black diaspora in America specifically, because I have, even though, I'm sure I have some ancestors in the motherland, like right now, especially the political climate in America right now, I think it's important to talk about. And creating some type of catalog from the moment I started making paintings up until this point. I think you could tell that the work is like, I would love to create a segment in art history for that. And also include my family in that too, because there's so much, and even just our conversation. I don't know much about your family, but I know there's so much there that there's to say, and there's so many beautiful people that the world doesn't know about.
Totally.
So, God willing, my career expands so I can talk about all of that, because there's so much there, and I would love to include that in the African American canon of figurative painting, and not just like, and really that's just American history.
Absolutely. Yeah. And as a final question to round out the episode, what do you think is like an essential maybe skill or characteristic necessary to be a great artist?
I think the most important skill or attribute is patience. I think you have to be patient with yourself, and that's probably my main struggle. Because sometimes I'm like, all right, this should be happening for me, or why haven't I gotten this accolade, or this residency I haven't done yet? But truly, it's just patient, and each of us have our own path, and so it's like, the more you accept that, I think the more distinct, powerful your voice will be. And for me, I think that's something that I've been learning recently. And just kind of like looking within, almost, not on a meditative level, but like kind of just self-reflecting on what really it is that you care about and what you're trying to contribute to society. And it's just, those are things that I really care about, and truly anybody who's practicing art making or film or sculpture or writing, I think there has to be a method that each person has to self-reflect to some capacity, because I believe that's what art is. It's kind of like telling your truth, telling your story. So I think the more you know yourself, the better the art will become. And I think you have to be patient in order to do that. Because, as humans, we frustrate each other, but I know I can frustrate the shit out of myself sometimes.
Totally.
And that's like, and that all goes into the art. And it is also so beneficial because people can see that you're being vulnerable within the art. Vulnerability is also another attribute that I think all artists should have, because you have to be vulnerable enough to make mistakes. And I think mistakes are the most important thing mistakes are the most important thing in life. More so than having success, because I've failed more than I've succeeded, but the failures that I've had have gotten me to where I am today. And like, I don't think I could have had this conversation with you a few years ago, just because like I had to make those mistakes in order to kind of fine tune what I'm doing right now.
Right.
And again, that kind of comes with patience, just like figuring out a method to kind of complete an equation. Like, this is not really clicking right now. I'm gonna figure out how to do, how to stretch this canvas differently, or actually just use a different material altogether to communicate, like layering, or it just takes a lot of trial and error. So I think making mistakes, obviously, like repeated mistakes, that's a problem. But I think mistakes are just on the opposite end of education and being patient. I think those two things are super important for an artist.
I couldn't agree more, and I love the sentiment of just being vulnerable and being open with yourself. I think it's super important. I talk to a lot of older artists who have been doing the work for 30, 40, 50 plus years, and it's really, really interesting to hear old folks talk about their experiences and kind of just share what they've been through, right? Share their experiences, share their life with you, and open up. And one of the things that I feel like has stuck with me that I heard from an artist recently was like, it's really about you getting at yourself. The work is really about going in and like digging deep into you. It's really not about the outside world. And when you think about it that way, and when you understand it from that lens and from that perspective, then it might be easier to just put that work in and that time in, because you're like, oh, this is actually the mission. The mission is really me getting deeper into me, and figuring out who I am.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, and that's also going into like the topic of, man, I mean, I couldn't agree more with what you just said, and I have a lot to say about that topic, because that's just like that's a lifelong journey right there, and that never ends, because once you figure something out, there's something else that you need to allocate your time to. It's just like an ever-going cycle, but I mean, that's kind of like what makes life so complex and so beautiful, is the fact that we are imperfect. And for artists and art lovers, there's beauty in that imperfection. And the beauty is I think imperfection is beautiful, because like what we do in fashion and in the beauty world, we try to polish it over,
Totally.
We try to polish out the blemishes, we try to like fix it up, but like there's people that are so beautiful and so unique looking just as they are. And I think that's like an effective approach to making art as well. It's like maybe leaving the mistake there sometimes, right, and not polishing it up. Right. I think that's life. And that's so realistic and integral to the practice of making art. And like, just getting, like you were saying, getting it. I don't know what artist said that, but I completely agree. It's
Ming Smith. Love, I know. Like,
love. Yeah. Right, I'm right there. So, man, that's so potent, because like, over the pandemic too, most of us were inside. We had no choice but to do that.
Right.
And,
right. I mean, yeah, and I think 2.5 years later, it's interesting to still kind of reflect on how, not only how difficult and transformative that time was, but like there's nothing that I think could have prepared people for what we went through. And I think on a very individual level, so many of the artists that I talked to really describe creative breakthroughs in that period. And then there were people who, not in the creative world that I am close to, that were going through like the crisis of like the crisis of identity, right? Because whatever it was that they were doing every day, they were no longer doing. The artist is already working on that, right? The artist is already trying to figure it out and putting in that daily work. The average person potentially isn't really taking the time to do that. So I just remember like recognizing these very distinct experiences that I was seeming to like touch to kind of like encounter. The artist who was going crazy with their creativity and opening up a lot more, and the average person who was like having a very difficult time.
Right.
And I thought that was quite interesting.
That is very interesting. It happens to artists too, because like you were saying, there's this juxtaposition between like associating what you do with who you are, and something, those two things, even though they're very closely related, that's not who you are as a spirit or a soul. Like that's just your occupation, and that's completely different from like your vessel. So like if I'm an auto mechanic and my shop's shut down for a year and I'm just sitting around like not doing anything, I might have a whole dilemma with like, what do I do with myself? Who am I? You know, you have to kind of reassociate with the internal dialogue.
Totally.
Because you're not distracted. You have to kind of refocus. And like you were saying, a lot of people went through that during those 2 years. And I think artists, you know, generally do that every day to some extent.
Yeah.
And even people like you. I mean, do you make art, or do you just artists and talk to? Okay.
I mean, it's a little bit complicated. Like I made art. I haven't made any visual art since before the pandemic. So, oh fuck, can you hear me?
Yeah, you cut out a little bit there.
Oh, okay, sorry. I was saying I hadn't made any art since like before the pandemic. Kind of like in the thick of the pandemic, I was making some paintings at home and just really playing. I was just experimenting. Like I went out, I bought supplies, I came back, I started making different things. But earlier in late 2019, I had applied for a residency program in Amsterdam that would have been happening in the summer of 2020, and that would have been a 3-month program where I would have had like lodging and everything. And I had a research project that I had presented, a research project that was a proposal I presented to the residency, and they loved the idea. And that would have been a combination of like photography, in like video interviews, film recordings, like recorded interviews, a bit of photos. And so it wouldn't have been me like actually making anything visually by hand. So not painting or sculpture or anything like that, but other forms of visual language like film and video and photography that would, and I was really interested in uncovering, you know, some of the kind of hidden stories of Amsterdam and the Netherlands more broadly as a place that had a really incredible, strong fixture in the slave trade. And, you know, the Dutch golden age that is referred to historically within the art and society and culture is also the period of like the most, you know, colonization by the Dutch, right? And so you have, on the one side, you have, oh, look at all of these things we've achieved. And on the other side, what nobody really talks about very publicly is like, you know, the incredible brutality and violence and oppression that the Dutch government was engaging in, you know, across the globe. So, and Amsterdam happens to be a place that's very multicultural because of that. So you have a lot of people from former colonies who have the ability to live in the Netherlands and to live in Holland. So you have people from Suriname, from Curacao, from former colonies in the Caribbean and the West Indies, former colonies in Asia. And so it just, the mix of people, like one of the things that really inspired me initially with Amsterdam, which kind of led to all of this, was like getting to the city and seeing people that were half Dutch, half Surinamese, or half Dutch, half Malaysian, or like half, Filipino and half something else, and thinking about like, how did that happen? Like, why is there so much mixing, And then that just led me to a journey of wanting to learn more. But all of that came to a halt during COVID. So I just pivoted and have been doing other things since. But I really do want to get back to those kind of like anthropological projects. Because while I don't see myself as a visual artist in the painting sense or in that sense, I do see myself as someone who wants to communicate ideas in other ways, like through conversation, through photography, through like film and video. And so those are things I'm interested in.
That's wonderful. Yeah. And it sounds like you, even though you didn't do the residency, you're kind of like creating a self-residency with what you're doing right now with light work.
Totally.
That's just a culmination of all these different artists, and everybody's background is different. So it's almost like you're traveling. And although it's virtual, but like you're traveling, you're getting ideas, you're talking, you're interfacing, and you're building up a collage of like these videos and all this information. So I really enjoy your work that you're doing.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. You've interviewed so many artists, so that's amazing.
I know, it's crazy.
Yeah. I appreciate you having me on. One thing I wanted to add, when you asked me about like talk about my work, what does it mean? That question I think is so layered, because it's like what my art means is just like what I am as a human, and I'm trying to learn that more every day, and with that journey becomes more and more layered. It's equivalent to using layers of paint, like scraping away, adding to, blending, subtracting, discovering. Those are all like methods of putting paint down, and like I think all those things blend in with the self-discovery, that inner journey. And so you think about a blank canvas, it's like, not to sound like too meta, but blank canvas is kind of like a beginning of life. There's just limitless possibilities. When a newborn comes into the world, they don't know their name yet, and they don't know what they're going to become, but they may become a brain surgeon, or they may become like a barber, but you don't know. The possibilities are endless. And like in painting, it's all about the discovery of self. Where do you want to take it? There's really no limits to what you can do on a blank canvas. You can paint a car, you can paint a frog, you can paint a shoulder, and you can paint all those things at the same time on the same canvas. And depending on how you position them on the canvas and what color they are and like what scale they are, they could send a very clear message, or they could send a message that is so confusing that you don't like. I'm kind of done looking at this painting. I don't want to look at this painting anymore. So my whole approach is like building up a visual vocabulary, kind of like what the Egyptians did with the hieroglyphs, like different figurations that can clearly contribute to art history. Like, this is what the people were talking about doing and practicing at this moment in time. And I think the best prophets or the best storytellers were the people that were like very careful of telling their personal stories at that time, to where people 10, 20 years from their lifetime or their lifestyle can clearly tell like what the state of politics were, what the state of like racial relations were, gender politics, all these types of things, And so, not to go on another tangent, but that's also maybe something I should have touched on in that question when I was answering the question. But I wanted to throw that in because what you were saying earlier about the residency that you're going to do, in the culmination of these audio, the audio files and the video files and the written work, that just kind of like, that spoke to me. So I just wanted to put that in there as well.
Thank you for sharing. I appreciate that addition because I feel like, sometimes these questions that I ask are super layered. So it's good to get like a full answer from you, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, look, sometimes in the moment, I'm kind of a person that does take a while to like, and for an interview process, you have to be a little quick. You can't wait too long. People think the video's lagging, but it's like you gotta. But sometimes you answer and you're like, wait, no, I want to add to that.
Right.
And I think this is part of painting too, talking about your work.
Totally. Well, this has been such a wonderful episode, and I'm so happy that you joined me.
Yeah, I'm happy that you invited me to be on the podcast. Thank you.
That was our episode with Marcus Leslie Singleton. I want to give a big shout out and a thank you to Marcus. And it's a wrap, folks. That's our episode of Lightwork Presents Everything is Connected. Conversations on culture and current events with some of today's hottest creative contemporaries. These episodes were recorded in between New York and Miami and reflect the times we are living in, while also adding some commentary to the social, cultural, and political issues of the past year. I'm your host, Folasade Ologundudu, and we'll see you next time. As always, stay motivated, stay inspired, and stay up. Peace and love, y'all. We out.